In the winter of 2015, every elevator office in Hardin County, Iowa, was telling the same story about yield. The story sounded a little different depending on who was doing the talking. At the seed meeting it sounded like genetics finally catching up to ambition. At the co-op it sounded like program discipline, sulfur, timing, fungicide, and a little faith in micronutrients when the weather behaved. At the coffee shop it sounded like bragging with enough local modesty laid over the top to keep God from noticing. But it was the same story all the way through. Real numbers were the numbers the scale could touch. Everything before harvest was just farmer talk. Anyone could predict yield in July. Anyone could act wise in August. And anyone who spoke too confidently before the combine crossed the first 100 acres was inviting the county to remember it later. That was the county mood the year Aaron Lathrop started writing down numbers people did not like. Aaron farmed north of Eldora on ground his grandfather once described as too good to waste and too uneven to trust. The farm had broad dark acres that could make a man feel smarter than he was in good years, and lighter shoulders, old traffic seams, and low spots that could turn confidence into accounting by Labor Day. Aaron was 47 in 2015, not young enough to be excused for ideas and not old enough to be protected by reputation. He was narrow-faced, calm in the way quiet men often are when they have spent enough seasons being underestimated, and so careful with language that local people sometimes thought he lacked conviction. He did not lack conviction. He simply did not believe every thought deserved to be spoken before it had survived a field. His father, Dwight Lathrop, had run the farm like a good Midwestern operator of his generation, honestly, conservatively, and with deep trust in habits built through repetition. Dwight respected the land, feared debt more than embarrassment, and believed the county had already invented most of the important answers if a person was humble enough to notice. Aaron had learned from him everything that mattered about timing, machinery, weather, and humility. But Aaron had also learned something his father did not mean to teach. He had learned that some habits survive not because they remain correct, but because they never fail loudly enough all at once to force a change. By 2015, Aaron had spent 5 years adjusting the farm in ways many neighbors considered overcomplicated and a few considered faintly arrogant. He had not become one of those men who speak in acronyms at winter meetings and come home with 3 binders and a dangerous new confidence. He still farmed like a practical man. But he had begun dividing fields more honestly. Not just by broad soil type, but by traffic history, drainage behavior, residue patterns, population response, and where the crop habitually lost the race before anyone admitted it. He used yield maps, yes, but he distrusted clean stories from pretty maps if they did not match what his boots and shovel already knew. He kept notebooks. He tracked side dress response by zone. He changed populations on ridges and lowers rather than letting the whole field carry the same ambition. He reduced tillage on certain acres his father had once considered too cold for that treatment. He added cereal rye after soybeans on selected fields, not for conference applause, but because too many spring rains were arriving hard and leaving faster than they should. To some people in Hardin County, that made him thoughtful. To many more, it made him a man with too many columns in his head. The elevator manager who mattered most to this story was named Glenn Roush. Glenn ran the Prairie River grain elevator outside Steamboat Rock and had spent 22 years in grain, enough time to develop the exact facial expression men like him wear when they believe weather and basis eventually punish all pre-harvest enthusiasm. He was not a bad man. In fact, he was better than most at staying polite while privately sorting farmers into categories. There were men who overpromised every year and blamed tests, storm lines, or hybrids later. Men who hedged wisely. Men who sold too soon out of fear. Men who waited too long out of vanity. And then there were the ones Glenn found hardest to categorize, the quiet farmers whose numbers sounded too deliberate to dismiss and too optimistic to welcome. Aaron Lathrop was drifting into that category. It began in July. That summer had started with a wet May, an unsettled June, and one of those early July stretches where the county still had enough rain in reserve to feel comfortable making plans. Corn stood tall. Soybeans had color. Nitrogen looked mostly safe. The county had not yet been taught anything cruel. Aaron came into Prairie River Grain one Tuesday morning to talk forward contracts on expected fall bushels. That in itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the number he put on paper. Glenn looked at it once, then again. "You're penciling this field at that?" he asked. Aaron said yes. Glenn leaned back in the chair and smiled the way a man smiles when he does not want to call another man foolish while also very much wanting to call him foolish. "That's a nice number for July." Aaron nodded. "It's not a July number." Glenn tapped the paper. "It's still July." The field in question was the West Mercer Quarter, a tract Aaron had rented 3 years earlier after a retiree decided his grandson loved accounting more than agriculture. It was a good farm in the broad sense, but like many good Iowa farms it had areas that had been lazily managed for so long people mistook their underperformance for natural law. The west knoll always burned first. The south draw took water and then gave it back badly. The old headlands carried historic compaction deep enough that roots made polite excuses around it. Most tenants before Aaron had treated the quarter as one average field with one average ambition. Aaron had divided it into response zones from the first year. He planted lower population on the lighter western rise because that area had never once thanked the county for more seed. He pushed the better center sections harder, but only where drainage and structure could hold the promise. He split nitrogen timing. He had worked on infiltration with cover ahead of corn. He had ripped one old compaction seam and then left it alone long enough to see whether the field knew what to do with the gift. He had even changed traffic paths in ways his father once said looked like farming with a geometry problem. Dwight had stopped saying that after watching 2 springs behave better than they should have. Glenn knew some of this. Elevator managers know more than farmers assume. They hear enough shop talk, delivery talk, and nervous contract talk to assemble rough biographies of whole operations. But what Glenn heard most often about Aaron was that he spent too much time measuring things and not enough time accepting what good Iowa dirt would do on its own. That was the county's simplified version, and Glenn liked simplified versions because they help a man sort risk quickly. He slid the contract paper back and said, "You sure you want to make me this promise?" Aaron answered in the same tone he used when discussing rainfall totals or hydraulic leaks. "I'm not promising weather. I'm telling you what the field is carrying." Glenn gave a small smirk then, not broad enough to qualify as insult, but not hidden enough to miss. "Well, I hope your map reads as pretty as your confidence." Aaron signed. That smirk would matter later because counties remember expressions almost as sharply as words. Now, if you want to understand why Aaron was so calm putting those numbers down, you have to understand that his confidence did not come from romance. It came from bookkeeping of a more intimate kind than most people practice. He had spent the previous autumn digging roots after harvest. He had watched water enter the field in spring instead of slapping off the surface like an insult. He had compared stand uniformity not only at emergence but in recovery after cold nights. He had split the farm mentally into areas that carried stress gracefully and areas that still behaved like men who cannot handle praise. By July of 2015, he was not guessing from road color. He was reading the field's internal posture. The county, of course, had its own posture. At the coffee shop in Eldora, a grower named Dennis Pohl said Aaron always ran yield estimates like he was trying to impress a computer. Another said if the West Mercer could do what Aaron claimed, half the county had been farming worse than they thought. Dennis answered, "That's exactly what he'd like us to believe." The line got a laugh because envy is easiest to hide inside humor. Aaron never heard that exact sentence, but he knew the mood. He had farmed in the county too long not to. When a quiet man becomes publicly specific, the county assumes vanity where there is usually only arithmetic. August tested everyone. The weather did not turn catastrophic. That would have been simpler. Instead it turned selective, which is much worse for local opinion. Certain storms missed the southern townships. Heat stayed a little too long on the lighter fields. Fungicide windows looked sharper on some acres than others. A number of operations that had looked equally magnificent in early July began diverging in ways road views could not entirely explain. Fields with weak subsoil habits started giving up their secrets. Better drained tracts held. Overplanted shoulders began showing strain. Some farmers got nervous and pretended not to. Others got louder, which is how farm country often handles fear. Aaron got quieter. He walked the West Mercer Quarter in the evenings, not because he enjoyed suspense, but because suspense is less dangerous when observed. He counted kernel rows. He cut ears. He noted depth differences between zones. He checked whether the lower populations on the West Rise had, as he suspected, protected the field from its usual late-season surrender. They had. The center blocks where he had carried more ambition also held because the field had the moisture and root environment to justify it. The South draw, usually too wet early and too thirsty late, behaved better than Dwight had ever seen it behave because the infiltration and traffic changes had taken some cruelty out of its personality. None of this guaranteed yield. But it did something more important. It preserved Aaron's confidence when other men were starting to bargain privately with their own estimates. Glenn Roush saw Aaron twice in August. The first time was at a local church supper where farmers stand in loose clusters pretending they are there for pie. Glenn asked how the contracts were looking. Aaron said about the same. Glenn smiled that same small smile and said, "You're either very right or about to get very educational." Aaron said nothing. The second time was at the elevator lot itself, where Aaron had come in for feed and a settlement question on old crop. Glenn looked over the latest county chatter on yield potential and said, "People aren't talking numbers like yours anymore." Aaron said, "That's because people talk from the road until the combine gives them permission." It was not a boast. It was a diagnosis. But Glenn heard challenge in it because men in grain often do. Harvest began under good conditions. That matters because clean harvest weather has a way of exposing field truths without giving farmers easy excuses. The first field Aaron cut was not the West Mercer. It was a smaller home tract, and the results there were good enough to keep his mood steady. Not county shocking. Just solid. Glenn heard about those first loads and stayed neutral. Elevator managers trust pattern more than anecdotes. The next farm did better. Then a third tract south of the creek came in stronger than Aaron's contract book had needed it to. Now the county began paying attention because Aaron had become dangerous in the local way a man becomes dangerous when his confidence starts leaving scale tickets behind it. Still, the West Mercer was the real test because that was the field Glenn had smirked at. Aaron started there on a clear Tuesday morning in late September. Dwight rode the first rounds in the buddy seat because he had lived long enough to know when a field is about to settle a family argument that has been running quietly under everything else. The combine climbed the West Rise first, where the lower population had once offended Dennis Pohl and half the coffee shop crowd who believed any choice short of full aggression was a confession. The monitor did not explode upward dramatically. That was never Aaron's style. What it did was hold. Hold better than the Rise had ever held. Then in the better middle sections the numbers climbed exactly where Aaron's notes said they should. The old compacted headland transition performed not perfectly, but far above history. Dwight looked from the monitor to the standing corn and back again with the expression older men wear when they realize their sons have been right in a direction they themselves never fully trusted. By noon Aaron knew he had not merely survived the contract. He had understated parts of it. Yield maps are among the most humiliating and beautiful tools modern farming has invented because they remember things people prefer to leave fuzzy. They remember which parts of a field were rescued by luck and which by management. They remember whether a farmer's story was broad enough to hide weak patches or specific enough to predict them honestly. When Aaron downloaded the West Mercer data that night and overlaid it against his winter zones, side dress splits, population changes, and old compaction notes, the map did something county people hate. It made private conviction public. The lower population western rise outperformed its own history dramatically. Not by miracle. By logic. The center sections responded almost exactly in the band Aaron had forecast. The trouble spots where drainage and structure were still incomplete showed up, but smaller and more contained than before. Most damning of all for the county's skepticism, the map looked less like luck than design. Not perfection. Design. Dwight sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open and said, after a long silence, "That's cleaner than I expected." Aaron said, "Cleaner than I expected too." Dwight nodded. "No. I mean the thinking." That was as close to praise as Aaron's father usually came. Word moved across Hardin County the way it always moves when a man people expected to be corrected by harvest is instead confirmed by it. Quietly first. Then with names. Dennis Pohl heard from a trucking driver before he heard from the elevator. The co-op heard by midday Wednesday. By Thursday morning Glenn Roush had already seen enough delivered bushels and enough grain settlement sheets to know what Aaron's fields were doing. But Glenn still had not seen the maps, and until he saw the maps he could keep the story in a category he preferred. Good year. Favorable spot. Nice farm. Fine. But then Aaron came in with settlement papers and, in the ordinary course of conversation, pulled out a printout. He did not do it theatrically. That is important. Aaron had no talent for theater. He was discussing zone-level performance with a seed rep when Glenn happened to be nearby and asked, with that practiced grainman tone of casual indifference, "So how'd your July confidence turn out?" Aaron handed him the map. Glenn took it expecting color and self-congratulation. What he found instead was something worse for his pride. Structure. Zones labeled in ways that matched Aaron's earlier contract confidence. Population decisions tied to results. Historic weak areas improved exactly where Aaron had said they would improve. The overall field average not only validating the contract number but showing that Aaron's estimate had not been broad optimism. It had been the field translated in advance. Glenn looked at the paper longer than he meant to. Then he said, "Well. It was not enough." The elevator office was quiet enough that two other men heard it and waited for the rest. Finally Glenn said, "Looks like the map came back on your side." Aaron took the paper back and folded it once. "It's not a side. It's just what the field did." That sentence followed Glenn longer than the smirk had followed Aaron. Now, the county might have forgiven one good field. Counties forgive anomalies because anomalies do not threaten habit. What they do not forgive easily is repeatable evidence. And repeatable evidence is what Aaron had. The maps from 3 other farms told the same broad story. His lower population choices on vulnerable areas reduced late stress. His drainage and traffic changes had narrowed historical weak spots. His residue and infiltration work were not just moral or aesthetic positions. They were now measurable in bushels. The county, which had laughed at his notebooks and his columns and his tendency to talk about zones instead of fields as if one was just a set of small obedient truths inside the other, had to decide what to do with a man whose numbers were no longer theoretical. Some reacted by learning. A younger operator named Cole Harned asked Aaron if he could come look at old map overlays and population decisions on one rented 80 that had been frustrating him for years. Another farmer quietly admitted he had been planting certain knolls like they were better than they were because it looked weak to do otherwise. Dwight himself, who had long tolerated Aaron's detail without wholly surrendering to it, began carrying a notebook in the combine and marking places the monitor and his memory disagreed. That mattered more to Aaron than anything Glenn Roush ever said. Others reacted by minimizing. Dennis Pohl said Aaron's results proved he had gotten the weather right, as if management were merely weather with paperwork. A seed salesman claimed Aaron's hybrid selection had done most of the work, which conveniently protected the salesman's worldview from the more difficult truth that many farmers buy good seed and then force it into lazy systems. The county's first instinct, as always, was to narrow the lesson until it no longer accused anyone of anything. But Glenn Roush changed more honestly than most. It started with a conversation in October after a long day of trucks and moisture tests. Aaron came in late with one last load. The office was nearly empty. Glenn was closing out tickets when he said, without much preface, "I ought to tell you I was too quick on those numbers." Aaron set the settlement slip down and looked at him. Glenn shrugged once, a movement that carried more reluctance than the words. "I've heard a lot of July certainty in this office. Most of it doesn't deserve October. Yours did." Aaron nodded. "Fields don't read the calendar the way people do." Glenn smiled a different smile this time. "Less practiced." "No. But maybe some people read fields better than others." That was not a grand apology. In rural terms, it was almost extravagant. The winter after harvest, Aaron was asked to speak at a local grower meeting. He nearly refused. He disliked rooms where people turned one season into a doctrine. But Dwight said he should go because, as he put it, half these men need to hear the field wasn't magic. Aaron stood in front of the room with printouts in hand and talked about zones, populations, compaction, infiltration, and yield history. He did not talk like a consultant. He talked like a farmer who had gotten tired of averaging his own farm into vagueness. He said the county's biggest habit, in his view, was overbelieving averages because averages let men remain proud while certain parts of their fields underperformed for 20 years. At the back of the room, Glenn Roush was there. Afterward, when a few men had left and others were still gathered around the coffee urn, Glenn told another elevator man from a neighboring town, "The dangerous thing about Aaron isn't that he predicts well. It's that he knows why." That line spread too, because it was true and because it came from a man people knew had once smirked at the same numbers. In Hardin County, reversals matter more when the witness has a reputation for skepticism. Aaron kept farming the same way after that. He did not become a county celebrity or turn his notebooks into a consulting side business. He kept adjusting fields. Kept digging. Kept proving to himself that some acres wanted less ambition and others wanted more honesty. The West Mercer quarter kept improving where it could and resisting where it still needed work. Dwight asked harder questions. Mason, Aaron's cousin, who had once mocked farming by spreadsheet, started variable populations on one rough farm and refused to admit the influence. The county changed, but only in the slow selective way counties do when evidence accumulates faster than pride can bury it. Years later, people remembered 2015 not because it was the best weather year or the worst, but because it was the year a quiet farmer walked into Prairie River grain with numbers the elevator manager did not believe. The county expected those numbers to come back smaller, humbled, made ordinary by harvest. Instead, the yield maps came back like a witness. They showed that Aaron Lathrop had not been talking from hope or vanity or some digital fantasy the county liked to blame for uncomfortable precision. He had been talking from a deeper and less forgivable place, the simple habit of observing a field closely enough that its future stopped looking like guesswork. The elevator manager smirked at his numbers. Then the yield maps came back. And once the maps spoke, the county could no longer pretend Aaron's confidence had been merely another July story.